£2 in coin, or the deed to Rattlebank Ropeworks. Edwin Mercer placed the alternatives on the counting-house table as though he were offering Ruth Ellison a choice of ribbons. On his right lay 2 sovereigns, bright enough to draw every eye in the room. On his left lay a folded deed tied in gray tape, its edges softened by damp. Behind Ruth, 40 looms stood silent for the noon meal, and nearly as many workers had found reasons to linger by the open doors. "Neither is what you owe me," Ruth said. Her voice held, though her hands were cold. For 12 years, she had woven Mercer's finest double cloth, correcting patterns his overlookers could not understand, and training girls who were paid half her rate. 6 pence from each weekly envelope had gone into what Mercer called the Skilled Workers' Reserve. The reserve, with her final month's wages and promised pattern premiums, came to £38, 7 shillings. She knew because she had kept every payslip in a biscuit tin beneath her bed. Mercer leaned back. At 46, he had the broad, carefully fed face of a man who called comfort proof of virtue. The reserve was discretionary. You forfeited it when you abandoned your loom. I stopped the loom because the shuttle guard had split. Ada Wynne nearly lost an eye. You stopped a room of machinery and encouraged disorder. He touched the coins. £2 is generous. Take it and sign the release. Ruth looked toward Ada, whose cheek still bore a purple cut from the flying splinter. The girl lowered her gaze. No one could afford to be brave with Mercer watching. "And the deed?" Ruth asked. "Payment in kind." His smile sharpened. "Rattlebank stands empty beyond the North Canal. Land, buildings, whatever fixtures remain. You have often said a woman's skill deserves ownership. Here is your opportunity." A few men laughed. Everyone in Whitcomb knew Rattlebank Ropeworks. A long, roof-broken shed sunk among nettles, condemned after 21 idle years. Its rate arrears alone were said to exceed its salvage value. Mercer had acquired it with a bankrupt cordage concern and failed to sell it. Passing it to Ruth would clear a nuisance from his books while making her poverty amusing. Mr. Pike, Mercer's solicitor, pushed a paper toward her. "Either settlement extinguishes all wage claims. The deed is properly drawn. Freehold ground, 116 yards from the canal boundary to the north wall, subject to existing rates and the borough notice of hazard." Ruth had £1 11 shillings in the world. 2 more would buy food and lodging for several weeks. The Ropeworks might take both before she slept one dry night beneath its roof. She thought of her mother, Helen, who had gone deaf after scarlet fever and learned to judge cloth by touch. Helen had taught Ruth to close her eyes over a weave, to feel where one thread crossed wrongly, and to distrust any bargain that required an answer before the heart had stopped racing. "Let me read the deed." Mercer's smile vanished. She read every cramped line while the room waited. The arrears were £8 14 shillings. The borough had ordered the western bays shored or removed within 60 days. Yet the conveyance was absolute, not a lease, and it included all patterns, tools, and articles attached to the premises. More strangely, Mercer warranted that he retained no key, claim, or chattel there. Ruth picked up the deed. "You are choosing ruin," he said. "I am choosing the thing you are most eager to be rid of." She signed. Mr. Pike witnessed it. Mercer swept the sovereigns into his drawer, and the looms began again before she reached the yard. By dusk, Ruth had carried her carpet bag, payslip tin, blanket, and her mother's little brass counting pin along the canal road. Rattlebank rose beyond a stand of black alders, narrow as a railway platform and 3 times as long. Slate had fallen from the western roof. Window holes stared across a yard furred with dock and nettle. The main doors leaned inward, chained but not locked, and a faded board declared the structure dangerous. Inside, the air smelled of wet wood, old hemp, and cold ashes. Her lantern found rows of beams, marching into darkness. Shallow cuts marked each one short strokes, pinpricks, Small hooked curves, too regular for damage and too varied for carpenter's numbers. Ruth raised her fingers to the nearest marks. 4 strokes. A gap. 2 hooks. Then a polished hollow, where many hands had rubbed the wood. It felt less like writing than a weaving draft. She had just slid the chain through the door handles when metal scraped behind her. A key turned in the smaller side door. The door opened, and a man stepped in carrying a shuttered lantern. Louis Parnell, Mercer's confidential clerk, stopped when he saw her. For one breath, neither spoke. Then his gaze moved past her to the marked beams. "You were not expected until morning," he said. Ruth closed her hand around the deed inside her coat. "According to this, you were not expected at all." Parnell recovered quickly. He was a narrow young man, with cuffs finer than his courage. "Mr. Mercer asked me to see that no company papers remained. He warranted that he retained no key and no goods here. Old locks collect old keys." He lifted his lantern, and Ruth saw fresh hemp dust on his sleeve. "You will find nothing worth keeping, Miss Ellison. Be wise, and sell the place back before the rates swallow you." He left by the side door, but not before trying the handle of a cupboard whose hinges had been reversed so it could not open against the wall. Ruth listened until his boots faded along the towpath. Then she wedged an iron marlinspike through the door ring and sat beneath the first beam until dawn. The patterned cuts above her and Parnell's words turning together in her mind. Morning made the ruin more exact. 7 western roof trusses were unsound. 3 windows had no frames, and a brick flue ended below the rafters, as if a stove had once stood where none remained. The long spinning floor bowed toward the canal. Rain had entered for years, but a central stretch beneath the marked beams was oddly dry. Every 9th beam carried a thumb-wide strip of black wax pressed into a groove. Mice had gnawed the edges, yet left the centers intact. Ruth spent 6pence on a stout padlock and another penny on chalk. Before fitting the lock, she copied the beam marks onto the backs of old mill circulars. Each beam held 8 positions. Some were cut deep, some shallow, some left smooth. To an untrained eye, they were meaningless tallies. To Ruth, they resembled instructions for raising and lowering shafts on a loom. At noon, a voice called from the yard. "If you light that flue, you'll smoke yourself before your creditors can." The speaker was Jabez Rowe, a retired sailmaker with 2 fingertips missing from his left hand. He rented half a cottage beyond the alders and had come to see whether the new owner was truly living in the shed. He inspected the roof without flattering her. £3 for timber if we sister the worst rafters," he said. "More if you expect elegance. 8 shillings for reclaimed slate. Labor depends on whether I like you. Do you? Not enough to climb today." He nodded at the beam copies. "Those marks have troubled cleverer fools than us. Boys called them witch sums. Rope men said they were proof tallies, though no two agree. Who made them? Lydia Fane, most likely. She managed Rattlebank when women were meant to carry tea, not orders. Built special cords for mills. Then there was a quarrel with old Adrian Mercer, Edwin's father. Contracts vanished. Lydia was called a thief. And the place failed. Ruth had never heard the name. "What sort of cords?" Jabez glanced toward the side door. "The sort Mercer sends clerks to look for after 20 years, perhaps." He agreed to brace 1 bay in exchange for Ruth mending a torn staysail and paying 2 shillings when she could. Together they cleared a stone-floored office at the eastern end. Ruth blocked a broken window with sacking, scrubbed soot from a small iron stove found beneath boards, and made a bed on a rope mat. By evening, 1 room could be heated without filling with smoke. The first visitor who did not come to laugh was 14-year-old Nell Carden. Her widowed mother took laundry from canal families. Nell delivered a basket of sheets to Jabez and followed the sound of hammering. Fever had taken most of her hearing when she was 6. She spoke carefully and watched mouths with fierce attention. Ruth showed her a beam rubbing. Nell turned the paper sideways, then ran her fingertips over the actual cuts. "This one repeats," she said, pointing to a deep stroke followed by two hollows. Here, here, and there. Ruth felt a quickening. Nell was right. The repeated group occurred near every doorway, though the surrounding pattern changed. That night, Ruth made a frame from 4 sound laths and tied 16 salvaged heddles across it. She threaded them with undyed linen from her carpet bag, assigning raised threads to deep cuts and lowered threads to shallow ones. The first beam produced only a ribbed strip, ugly and stiff. The second made the same ribs reversed. She unpicked both, changed the order, and tried again until her fingertips cramped. Near midnight, she laid the third strip across her closed palm. It held a broad, smooth channel with 3 raised bars on one side. Her mother had once sewn such bars into the hems of household cloths, 1 for flour, 2 for oats, 3 for soap, so she could identify them without sight. These bars did not name goods. They pointed. All 3 leaned toward the eastern door. Ruth carried her lamp there. At waist height, beneath grime, a line of iron staples ran along the wall. They continued past the office, turned at the doorway, and ended beside an empty bell bracket. A rope had once passed through them, low enough to grasp in smoke. When she returned to her frame, she found a narrow curl of new hemp lying across the cloth. It had not been there before. Someone had watched her through the broken window. Ruth slept little. At dawn, she nailed a board over the window and carried her pay slips to Mr. Hales, a solicitor who worked above a baker's shop. Hales was not charitable, but he had once helped Helen Ellison write a complaint when a landlord refused to repair a stair. He charged Ruth 2 shillings to examine the deed and lessened the fee only after she agreed to copy his correspondence for an afternoon. "It is a spiteful transaction," he said, "but apparently a valid one." Pike was foolish enough to make Mercer's warranty specific. If his clerk entered under a company key after conveyance, record the date and find a witness next time. Can Mercer take the property back? Not because he regrets giving it. The rates can force a sale, and the borough can order dangerous portions removed. Those are your immediate enemies. Ruth left with £6 12 shillings still to find before the rate hearing. She took in mending from canal boatmen and accepted 2 days' work dressing warps for a small handloom shop. Jabez shored the first roof bay. Nell swept, sorted usable hemp from rot, and learned to make eye splices with her quick, narrow fingers. Mrs. Carden brought soup and disapproved of everything, especially unpaid labor. Within a fortnight, the eastern office, 1 weaving corner, and 30 feet of the long floor were dry. Progress drew spectators. Most predicted collapse. One man offered 5 shillings for the iron staples. Ruth refused. Another called Lydia Fane mad. An elderly former spinner named Amos Reed stood at the door and remembered women testing ropes in darkness, but he could not say why. Ruth copied 8 more beams. The patterns formed not words but operations. Direction, height, obstruction, stop, climb. The repeated doorway group meant safety, she thought. When she wove beam 12, the cloth produced alternating hard knots and soft floats. Nell read them with her eyes closed faster than Ruth could. 3 quick. 1 long, Nell said. Then 3 quick again. Jabez found a small bronze bell under the floorboards, its clapper missing. Its rim had 4 striking faces, each worn differently. He hung it on the empty bracket and tapped it with a spoon. 3 brisk notes. 1 drawn scrape. 3 brisk notes. Even Nell felt the sequence through the wall staples when her hand rested on one. An alarm line, Ruth said. Not merely a bell. A line a person could feel. Jabez looked along the dark shed. In a rope walk, perhaps. In a mill full of looms, a shout goes nowhere. So did a bell, Ruth knew. If a worker could not hear it or smoke hid the exit. Her mother had been struck by a cart she never heard approaching. Ruth had spent years resenting every world designed as if hearing were a moral accomplishment. They stretched a salvaged rope through the staples. When Jabez pulled from the far bay, the bell sounded, and the fibers kicked against Ruth's palm. Different knots could tell a blind hand which way to move. The beam cuts were drafting instructions for woven sleeves and knotted stations along the line. On the following morning, Edwin Mercer arrived in a polished cab. He did not step into the mud until Parnell laid a board for him. Ruth met them in the yard, where Jabez could hear every word. Mercer held out an envelope. £5 for reconveyance. I am willing to spare you the rate proceedings. You valued it at £38 7 when you owed me that sum. I valued your release at that sum. Do not confuse the two. His eyes shifted to the rope passing through the wall staples. You have been playing with unsafe apparatus. What did Lydia Fane build here? Parnell's face betrayed recognition before Mercer answered. An impractical assortment of alarm cords. She accused reputable men of stealing her notions. Illness made her fanciful. Then why did your clerk enter with a key? Mercer's expression barely changed. To remove company property mistakenly left behind. Your deed says there was none. The offer rose to £7, then 10. Ruth refused each one. When Mercer left, the cab wheel crushed the first green shoot in the yard. Jabez waited until it had vanished. £10 would clear your rates, he said, and buy him whatever he fears I will find. Principal makes a poor roof tile. Then we shall need a better customer. Ruth's first order came from Mrs. Carden, though no money accompanied it. The laundries carrying straps cut her shoulders raw, so Ruth wove a broad double-cloth band from usable flax around a hemp core. She placed ridges at equal intervals, making it easy to grip with wet hands. Jabez tested it with a sack of bricks. It held. Mrs. Carden showed it to a brewer's drayman, who ordered 2 straps for 4 shillings. A canal carrier wanted a tow-line splice. Ruth used the first earnings to buy oil for the roof tar, and the next to pay Jabez. She kept every amount in a new account book where anyone working at Rattlebank could see it. The borough rate hearing gave her 30 additional days after Mr. Hales presented receipts for repairs and a schedule showing orders worth £1 3 s. The committee did not forgive the arrears, but it accepted £2 on account. Ruth walked home with an empty purse and a stamped extension. That evening, Nell found the reversed hinge cupboard open. Nothing obvious was missing. Behind it, however, the plaster bore a rectangle less weathered than the surrounding wall. Ruth measured the office outside and in. The difference was nearly 4 feet. They removed the cupboard carefully. Its back was solid oak, but its shelves slid free in a fixed order. On the final shelf, shallow ridges formed another weaving draft. Ruth copied it, threaded her small frame, and produced a strip that began with the doorway sign and ended with the symbol for upward movement. Above the cupboard, disguised by soot, a square panel opened into a narrow loft between ceiling and roof. Jabez enlarged no hole. He insisted that evidence remain as found. He raised Ruth on a ladder while Nell held the lamp. The loft was dry, lined with tarred felt, and empty except for a long tin case, a wooden tension gauge, and 12 coils of cloth-wrapped cord. Ruth lifted the nearest coil. Along it ran distinct stations, round knots, flat woven collars, paired bumps, and one unmistakable arrow-shaped ridge. A person could follow it in total darkness. The tin case held pattern cards, each punched in 8 columns, and 6 unsigned statements describing a mill trial. Workers had been blindfolded, while smoke from damp straw filled a practice room. All reached the marked exit by keeping one hand on the guideline. One writer added that a deaf carting girl had felt the alarm before hearing workers did. The names, dates, and final page were gone. At the bottom lay a child's slate scratched with 7 words. When sound fails, the hand must be warned. Ruth had scarcely finished reading when a stone broke the office window. It struck the stove and fell among hot coals. Jabez smothered the sparks with his coat. Outside, Boots ran toward the canal. The stone was wrapped in a printed notice announcing that Rattlebank housed stolen factory designs. No printer's name appeared below it. By the next market day, copies hung on 3 walls in Whitcomb. Mercer denied knowledge, while telling anyone who asked that Ruth had been dismissed for dishonesty. 2 customers canceled orders. The handloom shop would no longer employ her. Mrs. Carden lost laundry from Mercer's managers, and Nell's older brother Tom was turned away from a warehouse job. Ruth considered carrying the tin case to Hales, but moving it openly invited theft. She wrapped the statements in oilcloth and hid them beneath Mrs. Carden's flour bin, recording every transfer with witnesses. The prototype lines stayed in the loft so she could study them. One pattern card puzzled her. Unlike the others, it could not be woven as a single layer. Its columns contradicted each other, unless 2 cloths were made at once and joined only at selected points. Double cloth was Ruth's best work. She set up a borrowed table loom in the office and spent 4 days dressing it with linen and black wool. The result was a hollow band with pockets at measured intervals. When filled with small wooden beads, those pockets created a language under the fingertips: door, stair, low beam, heat, clear passage, injured person, wait. It was not an alphabet meant to spell every thought. It was a vocabulary for escaping danger when sight and sound could not be trusted. Nell learned all 7 signs in an hour. My mother would have known them, Ruth said. Then teach people who still can, Nell answered. They began with 6 children in the yard. Ruth tied lines between posts and blindfolded them one at a time. The children laughed until they met the sign for a low obstruction and ducked beneath a rail. Amos Reed watched from the gate. On the second afternoon, he removed his cap and asked to try. With cloth tied over his eyes, he followed the line to the eastern door. At the bell signal, he turned correctly and found the clear passage mark. When the blindfold came off, tears had traced pale lines through the dust on his cheeks. I saw Lydia do this, he said. Not here. At Mercer's old finishing mill in 51. Adrian Mercer locked one practice exit to prove her cords confused people. A girl broke her arm at a window. Lydia made us sign what happened. Afterward, Mercer said the trial had never taken place. Did you sign? With a cross. My name was beside it. The unsigned statements in the tin case suddenly had voices. Amos agreed to make a sworn declaration before Hales. 2 other surviving workers might remember. One had gone to Leeds. Another kept a lodging house in Huddersfield. Ruth could not afford the search, yet she could afford even less to leave the unsigned pages unsupported. Mrs. Carden pressed 7 shillings into her hand from the laundry jar and refused to call it a loan. Ruth and Nell took the cheapest morning train to Huddersfield. Sitting on a wooden bench in a 3rd-class carriage with a basket of bread between them. Ruth had not ridden by rail since her mother's funeral. Each whistle made Nell watch the other passengers' faces to learn whether it signaled danger or merely a station. The lodging house belonged to Martha Baines, formerly Martha Kay, who had wound twine at Rattlebank before entering Mercer's finishing mill. She was 60 now, broad-shouldered and suspicious, with 6 tenants' boots drying beside her range. At Lydia Fane's name, she shut the parlor door. I have a respectable house, she said. I will not have old accusations carried into it. Ruth showed her no promise of money and made no speech about justice. She placed one of the newly woven tactile collars on the table. Martha stared at the raised doorway mark, then touched it with the back of one finger. That ridge should be narrower, she said at last. A frightened hand mistakes it for the stair sign. Nell leaned forward. You helped make them. Martha had done more. She had worked beside Lydia, after losing much of her hearing in the scarlet fever ward. Lydia asked her to test every symbol without looking. During the 1851 trial, Martha had been among those sent into the smoke room. Adrian Mercer ordered a side exit bolted because he wanted the volunteers forced toward the door where his investors waited. The altered route contradicted the guideline. Martha struck the locked door, turned too late and fell through a low window, breaking her arm. He said I panicked because I could not hear instructions, she said. Lydia said the instructions had failed me because a man changed the room. From a sewing box, Martha brought a short piece of flattened braid. She had hidden it for 23 years inside the hem of her Sunday bonnet. Its stations matched Lydia's pattern cards, including a tiny diagonal ridge Ruth had omitted as decorative. Martha explained that it meant the route had been inspected since the last alarm drill. The missing mark humbled Ruth more usefully than praise would have. She had reconstructed a language, but nearly discarded its grammar. She asked Martha to correct every symbol she remembered. Nell wrote the meanings while Ruth made rubbings of the braid. Martha would not travel to Witchcombe, but she signed a declaration before a Huddersfield solicitor, who witnessed both her statement and the old braid. She also gave Ruth the name of Lydia's former legal clerk in Leeds. The man had died, but his firm had survived under new partners. On the return journey, Nell kept the braid wrapped in Ruth's handkerchief. If Mrs. Baines had burned it, she said, we would never know about the inspection mark. That is why Lydia used 64 beams, Ruth replied. One frightened person should not have to carry all the proof. They reached Rattlebank after dark to find Jabez asleep on a chair beside the locked office, a hammer across his knees. He pretended he had only paused to rest. Ruth entered the rail fare, and Mrs. Carden's 7 shillings in the public account before she did anything else. The news reached Edwin Mercer quickly. His next letter was courteous. He offered £15 for all designs, samples, and claims associated with Lydia Fane. In one paragraph, he referred to her graduated relief web, a phrase Ruth had seen only on the back of a pattern card from the loft. Mr. Hales read the letter twice. He knows what was there. Keep this. Can it prove theft? Not alone. It proves knowledge, he denied. With his clerk's entry, his key, and a witness, it begins a chain. Ruth refused the offer and sent a copy of the trial statements to the Borough Fire Committee. Witchcombe had begun discussing new alarm rules after a warehouse blaze trapped 12 workers on an upper floor. Alderman Grant, who chaired the committee, visited Rattlebank with 2 firemen. He did not declare the system wonderful. He pulled until one old splice failed, criticized the bell bracket, and said no public body would buy devices based on unsigned papers. Then test what we can make now, Ruth said. Grant granted her 6 weeks to prepare a demonstration in the disused drill hall, where smoke exercises were already held. Mercer and Company had submitted its own tender for a system of overhead alarm cords and escape ropes. Ruth understood then why Mercer wanted Lydia's patterns before the committee met. She also understood how little she possessed. The Rattlebank loom could weave only narrow bands. The roof leaked over the laying floor. Good hemp cost money, and the original cord treatment was not in the tin case. Her hands knew structure, not chemistry. She could reproduce the tactile sleeves, but an alarm line that stretched in heat could mislead people more dangerously than no line at all. Jabez remembered barrels once delivered to a brick room at the western end. That room had collapsed inward years ago. Rather than invent a formula, Ruth examined the surviving cords. Under magnification borrowed from a watchmaker, she saw pale crystals lodged beneath the outer flax. She took fibers to Mr. Bell, the apothecary, and paid him to identify only what he could honestly distinguish. He found alum, glue size, and traces of soluble glass, all known materials, but could not tell their proportions. We will test variations and burn the failures, Ruth said. For 3 weeks the yard smelled of wet fiber and scorched cloth. Ruth kept exact notes. Jabez built a weighted frame from old proofing gear. Nell timed each sample against an ordinary candle and then a hotter brazier at a safe distance. The treated covering did not become fireproof. Ruth refused that word. The best version resisted sparks, charred slowly, and preserved the hemp core long enough for escape. She marked every limit in her tender. Local opinion changed by inches. A cooper gave scrap oak after Ruth repaired his lifting sling. Canal men paid for guide knots on lines used at night. Mrs. Carden organized women to braid outer sleeves at home for a posted rate. Ruth paid even when their work had to be redone, though she charged the lost fiber to training. One skeptic, the innkeeper Bale, continued predicting fraud and ruin to anyone buying ale. Mercer escalated more quietly. A supplier in Leeds withdrew Ruth's hemp credit after receiving a warning about disputed ownership. The borough inspector appeared twice in 1 week. Then Tom Carden found Parnell measuring the western boundary after dark. Ruth reported each incident to Hales and kept copies. The moral cost arrived as a choice between the roof and a family. Mercer dismissed Amos Reed's grandson for giving Ruth access to his grandfather. The household faced eviction from a company cottage within 7 days. Ruth had £4 saved for slates. Without them, the autumn rain would stop production. With them, the Reeds could rent 2 rooms and move their bed before the bailiff came. She gave Amos £3 10 shillings and watched Jabez turn away to hide his disappointment. "The building cannot help anyone if it falls," he said later. "And the system means nothing if we sacrifice the first people who speak for it." He did not answer. The following morning he arrived with 6 canal men. They stripped slate from an unused lean-to and covered the working bays. None accepted money. Ruth entered their hours in her book as a debt to be paid from the first large order. The demonstration was 10 days away when a bailiff sealed the office. His order bore the county court stamp and named a chattel mortgage executed by Lydia Fane in 1858. Edwin Mercer claimed the mortgage conveyed every loom, pattern, and piece of cordage associated with her alarm devices to his father's company. Until the claim was heard, nothing in Rattlebank's loft could be moved or used. Ruth sent for Hales. He arrived too late to prevent Parnell and 2 hired porters from removing the tin case, pattern cards, tension gauge, and original lines. Parnell carried the case past Ruth with a look almost apologetic. "You were warned," he said. The legal paper allowed them to take disputed chattels, not damage the premises. Yet when Ruth climbed into the loft after their departure, she found the anchor rail torn free and the plaster ceiling split. Her table loom below lay crushed. 3 weeks of woven samples were soaked where a water jug had overturned across them. The borough committee canceled her demonstration place because she could not show lawful possession of the design. Mercer's tender remained on the schedule. For the first time since signing the deed, Ruth wondered whether 2 sovereigns would have been wiser. The Ropeworks had consumed her savings, endangered her friends, and returned the same lesson the mill had taught. A man with stamped paper could rename another person's labor and make the lie official. Nell sat beside the ruined loom, touching the warped bands. "This sign still says clear passage," she said. "There may be none." Then why did Lydia put messages on every beam? She could not have expected 1 tin box to survive. Ruth looked up. The beams had remained when every movable thing was stripped. The marks were not decorations surrounding a hidden cache. They were the archive. No bailiff could carry without dismantling the building. Mr. Hales returned with a certified copy of the alleged mortgage. Ruth spread it beneath the office lamp. The writing imitated an older hand, and the red seal was cracked convincingly. Hales pointed to a witness who had died in 1856, 2 years before the stated execution. That was suspicious, but could be dismissed as a copied date. Ruth touched the paper. Its surface was too even. Holding it to the flame, she saw a watermark. Baxter Fine, Wov 1870. 1. This sheet was made 13 years after Lydia supposedly signed it, she said. Hales's mouth tightened. That will interest the judge. The paper proved fraud, but the hearing would come after the drill hall contract. Ruth needed the legacy itself. She and Nell copied every remaining beam mark, 64 rows in all. Jabez repaired the table loom enough to move the shafts. Working in turns, they wove each row as a narrow double band. Some produced safety symbols they knew. Others gave numbers, pull sequences, and what Ruth had mistaken for meaningless floats. She laid the bands in beam order across the long floor. The floats joined from one strip to the next, forming a continuous raised cord along the cloth. It did not picture a map or spell a sentence. It enacted an instruction. Every few feet, the cord crossed a pocket containing one wooden bead, then two, then three. Nell walked the line with her eyes closed and stopped where the sequence ended beneath Bay 42. At that point, the floor appeared ordinary. But the old laying rails had 7 bolt holes on the south side and only 6 on the north. Ruth inserted her mother's brass counting pin into the unmatched hole. It struck metal 3 inches below. They lifted no plank until Hales and Alderman Grant arrived as witnesses. Beneath the laying floor lay a brick-proofing trench, once used to stretch cord under load. Its access hatch had been planed flush and packed with tarred oakum. Inside, dry air smelled faintly of mineral salts. Tin cylinders rested on racks above the floor, safe from damp and hidden under the very apparatus auctioneers assumed had been removed. The cylinders held Lydia Fane's complete work. There were dated trial books, chemical proportions with warnings against excessive stiffness, weaving drafts, bell codes, and signed statements from 32 workers. Amos Reed's cross appeared beside his name. There were drawings for low guidelines, rescue slings, stair indicators, and tactile collars, designed to be understood after a single practice. Lydia had included failures as carefully as successes. The final cylinder contained letters between her and Adrian Mercer. He had financed the 1,851 trial on condition that he receive first opportunity to manufacture the system. After he locked a practice exit and a worker was injured, Lydia refused to certify the trial as successful. Mercer demanded her patterns anyway. When she refused, he accused her of misusing funds, persuaded suppliers to withdraw credit, and circulated the story that she was unstable. Most important was an agreement witnessed by the borough fire warden and deposited in duplicate with a solicitor whose successor still practiced in Leeds. It stated that all designs would remain attached to Rattlebank Ropeworks unless Lydia voluntarily assigned them in a separate deed. No such deed existed. A letter from the Leeds firm confirmed in 1860 that the designs had never been transferred. Lydia's last notebook explained the beam code. She had carved the drafting rows openly so the system could be reconstructed if papers were stolen. She chose a weaving structure because it demanded patience, touch, and practical knowledge qualities her opponents dismissed when women displayed them. Helen Ellison's household ridges had not been Lydia's invention, but the same human need connected them. A message should reach the hand when it could not reach the ear. Ruth read until sunrise. Lydia had died in a charitable infirmary. Not mad, but poor, having spent her final years teaching deaf children to braid. There was no hidden fortune. The material value lay in sound designs, a usable works, and an imminent market for honest safety equipment. The intellectual value was a language tested by ordinary workers. The legal value was proof that Mercer's claim was forged. The emotional truth was harder. Lydia had known she might never be believed, yet had left her knowledge in a form another skilled woman could recover. At 8, Hales took the certified mortgage copy, the 1,871 watermark rubbing, and Lydia's agreement to the county court. By noon, he had an emergency order returning the seized articles and restraining Mercer from presenting them as his own. The judge also directed that the original mortgage filed by Mercer be impounded. The drill hall committee restored Ruth's place on the schedule, though she now had 3 days instead of 10. Hales advised placing the cylinders in his strong room until the hearing. Ruth refused to let them disappear again, even into friendly custody. Instead, she divided the evidence in daylight before 5 witnesses. Hales kept the original agreement. Alderman Grant received the trial book and sealed it at the borough office. Martha's braid and declaration went back to the Huddersfield solicitor. Jabez guarded the formula book at Rattlebank, and Ruth sent handwritten copies of the essential drafts by registered post to the Leeds firm. The cost pained her, but Lydia's method, had already taught the principle. Truth survived by being distributed among people who understood their responsibility. The lead's reply arrived the next afternoon. In an iron deed box overlooked during 3 changes of partnership, the firm had found its counterpart of the 1851 agreement, bearing the same witness signatures and a docket recording that no assignment had ever been lodged. A junior clerk brought it personally on the evening train. He was not an expert summoned to solve a mystery. He was the custodian of the second half of a record Lydia had deliberately created. He compared seals with Hales, noted differences caused by age, and agreed to testify only to the firm's custody and docket. Ruth spent an hour deciding what the demonstration must not claim. Lydia's system could not prevent fire. It could not make negligent owners careful. It could not guarantee that panic, broken fittings, or unpracticed hands would never defeat it. The guideline offered a second route for information when sight and hearing failed. Its value depended on clear exits, regular drills, and honest inspection. Those limitations became the first page of Ruth's tender. Mercer will promise more, Jabez warned. He always has. She rewove Martha's inspection ridge into every collar and ordered the finished lengths checked twice, once by a sighted worker reading the color threads, once by Nell reading only with her hands. Any disagreement sent the piece back to the loom. The discipline cost them precious hours, but it turned the recovered legacy into present work rather than a relic protected from use. Rattlebank worked without stopping. Parnell returned the tin case under a constable's eye. One original line had been cut into sections, but the cuts exposed the construction and proved it matched Mercer's tender samples down to Lydia's uncommon double sleeve. Jabez rebuilt the tension frame. Mrs. Carden's braiders finished 60 yards of guideline. Nell trained 8 volunteers in the cymbals. Amos and the canal men rigged the bell pulls. On the evening before the test, Ruth inspected every length herself. Near the middle of the alarm cord, her fingers found a splice too smooth. Someone had replaced a 6-foot section with loosely laid jute that would stretch under load. The cord bore Rattlebank's red thread at both ends, making the weakness look like her work. She did not accuse anyone in the empty hall. She cut out the false section, sealed it in a canvas evidence bag, and asked Alderman Grant to mark the seal. A porter remembered Parnell delivering a parcel that afternoon. Hales sent a constable to find him. The drill hall filled the next morning with mill owners, firemen, reporters, and workers, permitted 1 hour away from their looms. Mercer stood beside an overhead system of white ropes and polished bells. His display was impressive at a distance. Ruth's low lines looked plain. Dark-treated cord in iron staples, tactile collars at intervals, broad rescue slings folded by the exits. Grant explained the test. Damp straw would make harmless but dense smoke. 12 volunteers, 6 from each system, would be blindfolded before entering separate practice rooms. At an alarm, they must locate a marked exit, pass one obstacle, and assist a weighted figure representing an injured worker. The exercise would be stopped at the first unsafe condition. Mercer objected to Nell's participation. A deaf child cannot respond to an audible alarm. That is the point, Ruth said. The doors closed. Smoke rolled through the rafters. Mercer's bell sounded first, clear to the audience outside. Inside, his volunteers reached overhead, found 3 hanging ropes, and pulled the wrong one. One rope released a window latch rather than indicating direction. A volunteer collided with the low barrier, and the marshal stopped their test. Ruth held the end of Lydia's alarm line. She gave 3 quick pulls, 1 sustained pull, then 3 quick. The wall bell repeated the rhythm, but Nell did not need it. Her hand felt the signal through the cord. Ruth watched nothing but the tension gauge. One volunteer followed the smooth side of the guide collar the wrong way, found the correction ridge, and turned. At the low obstacle sign, all 6 ducked. They located the weighted figure by the paired bump station, fitted the broad sling, and moved it together. When they emerged through the safe door, their faces were sooty and serious, rather than triumphant. The test had taken 4 minutes 12 seconds. Ruth then cut a sample of her treated sleeve and held it over a controlled brazier with the fire captain beside her. It charred, smoked, and finally burned. She stated the time and the limitation. It gives minutes, not miracles. It must be inspected, practiced, and replaced when damaged. Mercer laughed too loudly. Miss Ellison has rehearsed a theatrical trick with stolen work. Hales stepped forward. He did not answer with rhetoric. He laid out Lydia's 1,851 agreement, the matching copy obtained that morning from the lead solicitor's successor, the signed trial statements, and Mercer's forged mortgage on a table. Amos Reed identified his cross and described the locked practice door. Mr. Pike, summoned under the court order, confirmed that Mercer had warranted no retained key or chattels when conveying Rattlebank. Jabez testified to Parnell's first visit and the purchase offers. Finally, Alderman Grant opened Mercer's submitted tender. Its graduated relief web reproduced 3 of Lydia's diagrams, including a drafting error she had crossed out in her notebook. Mercer had copied even the mistake. Parnell entered the hall between 2 constables before the committee could adjourn. Faced with the substituted jute and the porter's statement, he admitted Mercer had ordered him to weaken Ruth's demonstration line. He also admitted filing the false mortgage, though he insisted Mercer's solicitor had prepared it. Mr. Pike rose at once and denied that part, producing letters showing he had refused to draft any claim without an original instrument. Mercer's public mask failed not in a confession, but in contempt. He called Parnell a disposable clerk, Amos a senile workman, Nell a defective child, and Ruth an ungrateful factory hand who should have accepted what she was given. Every sentence showed the committee exactly what his polished tender had concealed. The borough rejected Mercer and Company's bid and referred the forged instrument and sabotage to the county authorities. It offered Rattlebank a modest contract, enough guidelines and training sets for the drill hall, infirmary, and 2 municipal warehouses, subject to monthly inspection. No one awarded Ruth a fortune. The first payment covered hemp, wages, rates, and the remaining roof work, with £11 left as working capital. Mercer's consequences unfolded over the following months. Parnell pleaded guilty to filing the false claim and damaging property, giving evidence in return for a lesser sentence. Mercer was convicted of conspiracy to defraud and fined heavily. The court ordered restitution for the seized and broken equipment. His insurers required unlocked exits and independent safety inspections before renewing his mills. 3 directors removed him from daily control after losing the borough tender and 2 commercial contracts. Ruth's wage release was set aside because Mercer had misrepresented the property's contents, retained access, and used a forged encumbrance to reclaim what he had conveyed. He paid the £38 7 shillings, plus costs. Ruth used none of it for velvet, silver, or revenge. She paid Jabez and the canal men every recorded hour, repaid Mrs. Carden for lost laundry work, and placed the remainder in a reserve whose rules were posted beside the Rattlebank time book. No deduction could be made without the workers' written consent, and every person could inspect the account. Restoration took a year, not a week. The unsound western bays came down under a mason's direction. Their sound timber roofed a shorter laying room. Glaziers fitted plain panes as orders allowed. A proper stove replaced the cracked iron one. The dry-proofing trench remained an archive, its documents stored in new tin cases above brick supports. Copies went to the Borough Records Office and to a school for deaf children in Leeds, so no single theft could silence Lydia again. Rattlebank hired slowly. Mrs. Carden supervised home braiders before moving into the works. Tom learned the proofing frame. Amos taught young rope makers how fibers failed and why pride was no substitute for testing. Jabez accepted the title of foreman only after Ruth agreed that Nell could call him Chief Worrier. The innkeeper, Bale, never withdrew his prediction of ruin. He merely began making it less often. Nell became Rattlebank's first paid instructor. She demonstrated the guide language to mill committees and corrected hearing men who assumed an alarm was useful because they could hear it. Ruth expanded the vocabulary carefully, refusing symbols that confused first-time hands. Every kit included practice, inspection dates, and the plain warning that no cord could excuse a locked door. Orders came from mills, hospitals, canal warehouses, and 2 theaters. Some owners bought the lines for reputation and neglected drills. Ruth canceled one contract when she found its exits chained. That refusal cost money and brought satisfaction of a quieter kind. Rattlebank would not survive by repeating Adrian or Edwin Mercer's bargain. In the second autumn, the borough placed a small plaque at the gate, naming Lydia Fane as designer of the tactile warning system. Ruth chose the words from Lydia's slate, but she did not mount the slate outside. It remained in the office where workers touched its grooves before their first day. On a pale October evening, Ruth walked the length of the restored Ropeworks after everyone had gone. Rain whispered on the repaired roof. The guideline ran through fresh staples at waist height, interrupted by collars woven on the loom she had bought with the municipal payment. Above it, the old beams remained rough and dark. Their cuts were no longer a message no one could read. Pattern copies hung in the training room, and children could weave the doorway sign before they could spell Rattlebank. At Bay 42, Ruth pressed Helen's brass counting pin into the old bolt hole, then slipped it back into her pocket. She thought of her mother measuring the world through cloth, of Lydia carving instructions into timber because paper could be taken, and of Nell leading sighted adults through smoke by touch. The building had not made Ruth valuable. It had forced the town to confront the value it had ignored in women's labor, in disabled knowledge, in warnings designed for the least protected person rather than the most powerful one. Rattlebank's roof still showed patches of 3 different slate colors, and one outer wall leaned enough to trouble Jabez on windy nights. It was neither grand nor finished. But when Ruth gave the alarm line 3 quick pulls and 1 long, a bell answered from the far end. A second later, Nell, waiting unseen in the yard, returned the signal through the rope. The message reached Ruth's hand before the sound reached her ear.